Hey guys, I'm back with round 3 of my tournament at the World Open. In this round, I was paired up against Grandmaster Dmitry Gordievsky, who has been around 2,600 FIDE, I think, for a while now, so definitely a really strong player, and I believe he plays a lot of these open events nowadays. So, yeah, I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for the game, and I don't think I was expecting the line he ends up choosing. He's mainly a d4 player. Here he plays knight f3, g6, c4. I go with my usual King's Indian. And yeah, I wasn't sure which line he was going to go for. I think he's played the fianchetto a couple times. He's also gone for the classical line with e4 like he does here. And after d6, I think I was mainly expecting bishop e2 here. But he decided to play the h3 system, known as the Makaganov line, or the Makaganov system. And yeah, this one is definitely pretty dangerous for King's Indian players nowadays. But well, I played a couple of training games in this recently, and so I wasn't too upset to see this over the board, because I felt like I had a lot of recent practice that I was hoping to use. Okay, so I played knight a6. Here white played bishop g5. This is not the most common move in the position. I think bishop e3 is a lot more popular against the knight a6 lines. And here actually I just want to show a position that is actually similar, because in the game we get the same position except black gets an extra move h6 here. So against bishop e3, black would typically play c6, let's say bishop e2, e5, and if white goes d5, black's idea in this line is usually to go knight h5 and try to establish this line on f4. Kind of typical King's Indian play, opening f5 up and then maybe even queen f6 at some point. And usually black gets good counterplay when we achieve this. In case white plays queen d2, this is one of the main moves in the position. Black is often just playing knight f4 anyway, which is a very thematic sacrifice in the King's Indian, where if white wants to take the pawn on f4, they're going to have to give up the dark squared bishop, and in turn black's dark squared bishop becomes an extremely strong piece, and black usually gets quite a bit of compensation in something like this. So this is kind of a key position, because in the game we end up getting this exact position, except black has gotten the move h6 in for free. So going back to the game, white played bishop g5. I chose c6, bishop e2. Here I decided to play h6 first, bishop e3, and now e5. And so this bishop g5, bishop e3 stuff, this happens in a lot of variations. Most commonly it's seen in the Averbach line, where white often goes bishop g5 early, and then against h6 always drops back to e3. And the main point behind doing this is usually that white is eventually going to get the tempo back with this move queen d2 that typically forces king h7, and this is kind of considered in white's favor, especially considering that black is kind of slightly weakened the king's side now. But in this line, I feel like it doesn't really make much of a difference here. After e5, d5, and knight h5, this all happened in the game. Basically have the same position, except black got this move in h6, and after queen d2, I'm not obliged to play king h7, but instead I can just play the immediate knight f4 and just sacrifice the pawn, much like in the other variation. So I felt like this should be okay for black. Over the board I actually wasn't 100% sure, because I was used to the position with the pawn on h7, and so I was kind of double checking and triple checking and making sure that there are no tactical reasons why having the pawn on h6 would be bad here. I thought maybe, the queen on f4 in some lines might be targeting the h6 pawn, but I think overall black should still be all right here. Maybe a more solid choice would be just to take on d5 in this position early on. White would most likely play c takes d5 here. I think this is the most natural choice. And then after knight f4, we kind of get the same position that we'll get in the game, except white is already committed to this exchange, c takes d5, c takes d5. No longer can white play e takes d5 or knight takes d5. And here I think black probably gets a better version of this type of position compared to the game. Because I think black gets a lot of compensation still on the dark squares. For example, like queen b6 here might be played, queen d2, bishop d7. And then black has ideas of putting a rook on e8, putting a rook on c8. And it's clear that black has plenty of compensation for the pawn. The e4 pawn is really weak. Black might go for the f5 break at some point and open up this diagonal. And yeah, compared to the game, black has a lot of the same ideas, but white doesn't really have any counterplay of their own. So okay, that's just something to kind of explore a little bit deeper, and with a strong engine. I decided to go for the immediate knight f4. I think this is still quite reasonable. Bishop takes f4, e takes f4, queen takes f4. And now maybe the best move here was the immediate queen b6, and kind of going for a similar style of play. Queen d2, rook e8, for example, castles knight c5. And yeah, I think this is a little bit better version for white now, because white still has some options to take on c6 at some point and maybe try to put some pressure against the d6 pawn. And here, if black is taking on d5, I think this is actually... is white to move in the position. When black takes on d5, then we have to watch out for knight takes d5, as well as potentially e takes d5, which might be leading to a better position for white. Objectively, I think black is doing pretty close to equal here. Maybe this is even slightly better than what happened in the game. In the game, I chose to move knight c5 first, which I think is also reasonable, but maybe queen b6 is more accurate, just forcing white's queen to d2 early on. In any case, I think black can still reach, let's say, dynamic equality in both lines. White castled, and yeah, here I was basically on my own. I felt like f5 should probably be the move here, which is kind of a thematic idea in these types of positions. Black is often just playing f5, and white trades off, bishop takes f5, and black has these two nice bishops on the diagonal. Queen comes to b6 maybe, or queen f6, and it does feel like black has some very reasonable compensation. After analyzing the position, I think black should instead probably play rook e8, which I was considering during the game, but I wasn't quite sure what to do after a move like knight d2, for example. And it turns out black has a couple options. I think queen g5 is actually the safest one for black. The point being, we're going to go into this endgame where we're down a pawn, but the dark square bishop is just so strong that it's hard for white to really utilize the extra pawn. For example, if white plays like f3 here, I was just looking at a sample line, bishop d7, knight b3. Black could take on b3, throw in bishop d4 check, and then put the pawn on c5. And a position like this, it's starting to become more clear how... why exactly the engine evaluates this as like basically dead equal is that white's extra pawn is just very hard to do anything with. If the knight ever jumps to one of these light squares, black can probably just trade it off and set up a pretty simple blockade on the dark squares. So long story short, this would be an extremely difficult endgame for white to try to win, and objectively white probably doesn't have much of an advantage there. So yeah, I really wish I had kind of spent more time, because maybe I would have consider this a little bit deeper, or maybe I would have realized that after f5 things are actually not that easy for black, and white is actually getting a very good position, because this is the move I ended up playing, but objectively it definitely is just a clear mistake. And all of a sudden, after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, queen d2, so far I think at this point white is actually just on the verge of being much better, with an extra pawn and also some threats incoming into the position. Basically, white wants to play rook ad1 and at a certain moment just take on c6, take the d6 pawn, maybe play knight d4 and just hit the pawn on c6, bishop coming to f3. It's actually a very dangerous position for black already. And according to the engine, it's like black is kind of like out of compensation, just like it's very close to +1. And even with best play, black just doesn't get much of anything here, and white is already seriously better. So it's basically, one move, f5, that all of a sudden ends up landing me in an extremely difficult position. I mean, I'd already spent a little bit of time here, but I definitely didn't think that I would be much worse, let alone like close to losing. But okay, definitely at this point I was still feeling at least somewhat optimistic. So I played queen f6. Rook ad1, and rook ae8, and I didn't really see what I had done wrong yet, so I felt like maybe black should still be okay, but it turns out this evaluation was not right. So my last move is just based on a concrete line. If white takes on c6 and takes on d6, then after queen d6, rook d6, bishop takes c3, and then the bishop on e2 ends up lost, and so black wins a piece and is doing well. But of course, white does not have to take right away, and instead he just plays knight to d4, which is both defending the bishop on e2, putting more pressure on c6, opening up the bishop to head to f3, and also, if needed, white is threatening to just take the bishop on f5 and get rid of black's only advantage in this position, which is the bishop pair. So yeah, very strong multi-purpose move. After some thought, I decided to play bishop d7. I simply just didn't see a reasonable move here for black anymore. For example, I was thinking about taking on d4, but this just leads to exchanges, and then there's no clear way for black to get any kind of compensation for the pawn, and white is just much, much better. I also considered knight e4 here, but the problem is after knight takes e4, bishop takes, white can go knight e6, and I felt like, again, I'm just very, very quickly running out of compensation. White might just take off my prized dark square bishop soon, and I'll just be a pawn down. Yeah, d takes c6 is still coming, and the d6 pawn might be really weak here. So that also didn't look good. Eventually I decided I just didn't have anything other than bishop d7. The engine doesn't really find much either. It's one of those positions where it suggests one move, then you start analyzing a bit deeper, and turns out it's worse than it thought, and yeah, it just feels like all moves are kind of leading to a bad position. So my opponent here decided to take on c6, b takes c6, and just play bishop f3. And I think it's quite impressive actually how easily he was able to turn a position that is supposed to be totally fine and acceptable for black, you know, pawn sacrifice but for full compensation, into something where white is just like totally winning, has the extra pawn, and at this point has some compensation as well, because now white's pieces are just very well coordinated and having a lot of targets in the position, whereas my pieces are seemingly well placed but have absolutely no targets. Okay, so I of course started spending a lot of time over these moves because I was slowly realizing that my position is getting like worse and worse. I considered a lot of stuff here, for example, like queen h4. I thought was a try where after white plays bishop takes c6, the idea would be to sacrifice on h3. And okay, I mean, definitely was a reasonable attempt. It just didn't really hold up to concrete analysis. So after white takes on h3, for example, queen takes h3. Sure, if white is foolish enough to take the rook, then black will have at least a perpetual check with queen g4, and of course that would be awesome, but white doesn't have to take more material. He's already up a piece, and he has a number of consolidating moves. The one I thought during the game was particularly good is just bishop g2, just pulling the bishop all the way back. With tempo, black will have to lose a move moving the queen, and then I kind of just stopped my calculation there. I figure white is going to have all kinds of ways of bringing in more pieces to the defense, and black shouldn't really have enough compensation for the piece. So that line didn't work. I again considered moves like queen takes d4, but these also just simply didn't hold up to concrete analysis. So here the idea of going for this endgame is that at least I would have bishop takes h3 at the end, but I'm only winning one pawn, and in the meantime all my pawns on the 6th rank are just terribly weak here. White can play rook takes d6, for example, and everything is hanging. This is hanging with check. This one is hanging with the knight hanging behind it, and yeah, black is just losing too many pawns here. Okay, so eventually I decided just to play rook c8. Again, I didn't see any reasonable active opportunities, so I decided I have nothing better than to just defend the pawn and hope for the best. And then white came up with the move b4, which I think is definitely the strongest move in the position, just knocking my knight kind of out of the game. I was actually considering for white the move knight takes c6. I thought this was actually very likely to be played. The point being is that if bishop takes c6, then white can take on c6, rook takes c6, and queen d5 check, winning back some material and winning the game. And if black plays rook takes c6 instead, then after bishop c6, well, black got 2 pieces for the rook, but after queen takes d6, white now has 3 pawns, and that's definitely more than enough material to justify going into such a situation, and I think white would have a huge advantage in this endgame. I mean, I think it's probably a decisive advantage, but compared to the game, it's actually, I would say, less easy for white to win the position than what we ended up getting. So I think my opponent kind of correctly avoided this. It kind of looks like a nice combination, but it leads us in this endgame where white is still going to have to make a few accurate moves before he can actually convert it, and the game might drag on for some time. It's always tricky to play against the two pieces. Instead, the move b4 is actually a lot cleaner. I would like to play the move knight to e6, but here I believe after, I think it was knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, and not sure if queen takes d6 is possible, or maybe just knight e4 first. Basically the position is kind of collapsing, the d6 pawn is hanging next, and if d6 falls, then white will get knight c5, and that's going to be bad. I feel like white also had another idea here that I'm currently forgetting, but yeah, basically the position is, at this point, is I'm down a pawn and I'm about to lose another one, so it's pretty bad. I decided to play knight a6 in the game. This is definitely not better. White chose to move knight e4, which I think is perfectly good. I mean, a3 is also possible, just defending the b4 pawn, but then you never know, maybe c5 one day might be annoying and kind of just opening everything up on the diagonal. So the way white played the game, I think, was totally sufficient. He goes knight e4. Now if I go back queen e7, I mean, maybe this would prolong the game more, but I just didn't see what to do after basically either rook to e1. Just kind of fully mobilizing. I mean, white's setup here is absolutely beautiful, and black's position is just full of holes and weaknesses. And again, I have the bishop pair, but it's just not enough in this situation. I think all of the other advantages are on white's side. So this position just looked totally busted to me. I just didn't see a good move here, and the threat is something like knight c5, for example. So I decided to take on d4. Going into this endgame, where I basically knew I was losing. I just didn't really see any great way of fighting on. Also, at this point, I think I was already running low on time because I had burned so much time earlier just trying to figure out how to get a playable position. There was nothing to be found, so yeah, I didn't end up finding anything, and yeah, just ended up in this kind of hopeless endgame. I played knight takes b4. My only chance here was that white somehow messes up the conversion process and maybe simplifies in the wrong way, or too many pawns get traded off, and maybe I get some drawing chances, but that wasn't super likely here. After knight takes b4, rook takes d6 was played. I played bishop takes h3. Now I think there's many ways for white to just get a huge advantage here. Okay, something I was hoping for example, was like if white just kind of naively recaptured, then I could take on f3. Let's say rook takes g6 check, king h7. I mean, white is probably doing very well here too with an extra pawn, but it actually doesn't feel so easy for white to use their extra pawn. All of their pawns are split. The passed pawn is going to be really hard to push, and with the reduced material, it feels like black's two rooks and knight can even cause a little bit of counterplay. So this doesn't feel like a very easy conversion to me. For example, instead my opponent just left the bishop on h3, which I think was a good choice because it's not really threatening anything. Instead played the move rook to b1, which is actually very strong, just activating the rook, hitting the knight on b4, and trying to invade with rook to b7 at some point. I played c5. He goes a3 and forces my knight to get out of the way. Knight to c2. And finally he finds the very accurate move knight f6 check, which blocks my rook on f8, and the point here is that if I play the move, if I don't play king g7, then white will take on h3 and black is just going to be down a piece. And if I do play king g7, which worked earlier because against g takes h3, I could just take on f6 and get my piece back. Well, here of course white has rook to b7 check. This is the whole point of starting with rook to b1. And black is not going to be able to keep the material here. I have to go something like rook f7, and then white can simply take on h3, and black is going to be down a piece. So after knight f6 check, I figured it's definitely a good time to resign. It's just I'm losing a piece concretely in all variations, and yeah, that was that. Kind of a tough game. After the game, actually, I wasn't even sure where I went wrong, because I thought f5 was a reasonable move, a thematic idea, but yeah, after the game, I analyzed it, of course, and I realized, okay, in this position, f5 was just not the right way to play it. Black needed to just put this massive pressure on the e4 pawn with rook e8. I should mention that this move, starting bishop takes c3, and this pawn is hard to defend. That's why white has to go knight d2. And then in some endgame like this, after queen g5, it turns out that black has enough compensation for the full pawn, which I definitely was not clear about during the game. So yeah, tough game. Felt like, I didn't really put up a whole lot of resistance, but sometimes that happens. You play a sharp opening. I went for this like thematic pawn sacrifice kind of somewhat casually, and yeah, if you don't know how to exactly back it up, sometimes your opponent can just take the pawn and end up with an extra pawn in just a couple moves, and feels like the game was over before it even started. But okay, this was just round 3. I was still on 2 out of 3, so not having a bad tournament at all. And there was 6 more rounds to go, so I'll be covering the next games in future videos. Take care.